This is a story about a sword with two edges, so perfectly sharp, so devastatingly effective, that they cut through the very fabric of the 20th century. One edge of this sword saved billions of lives, it defeated famine, pulled bread from the air, and is the reason why our planet can sustain a population of 8 billion people today. It was a miracle of science, a triumph of the human intellect that promised a future free from starvation. The man who forged this edge was hailed as a hero, a savior, and was awarded the highest honor in science, the Nobel Prize. But this is a story about a sword with two edges. The other edge of the sword was designed not to save, but to kill. It was an edge of pure, calculated horror. It introduced a new form of warfare so terrifying, so indiscriminate, that it was condemned by the world as a crime against humanity. It was a weapon that didn't just break bodies, but shattered minds, turning the very air men breathed into a chemical fire that drowned them from the inside out. The man who forged this edge was branded a monster, a war criminal, a harbinger of a new and terrible age of death. The unbelievable, terrifying, and tragic truth of this story is that both edges of this sword were forged by the same man. His name was Fritz Haber, and his life is perhaps one of the most profound and disturbing paradoxes in all of human history. He is the man who gave us the Green Revolution and the man who gave us chemical warfare. He is the scientist whose work feeds the world and the scientist whose work became the blueprint for the gas chambers of the Holocaust. He was a German patriot, so desperate for the approval of his fatherland that he would sacrifice anything for it, including his own morality. He was a husband whose ambition drove his own wife, a brilliant scientist herself, to an act of ultimate despair. He was a Jewish man who, in a final bitter twist of irony, would be cast out and hunted by the very nation he had dedicated his life to serving. How? How can one person contain such contradictions? How could the mind that solved the world's food crisis also conceive of a weapon that would haunt our nightmares for over a century? Was he a brilliant mind seduced by the siren song of nationalism? A tragic figure who lost his moral compass in the fog of war? Or was he simply a man who believed, with all his heart, in a terrible idea, that science must serve power no matter the human cost? This is the story of the scientist who invented chemical warfare and lived long enough to regret it. It's a story about the complex relationship between genius and morality, between patriotism and humanity. It's the story of Fritz Haber and the two-edged sword he left behind, a legacy of both creation and of unimaginable destruction. To understand the hero, you must first understand the monster he was trying to slay. And at the turn of the 20th century, humanity was staring a monster right in the face: global starvation. For centuries, thinkers like Thomas Malthus had issued a dire warning. The human population, he argued, would always grow faster than its ability to produce food. It was a mathematical certainty, a ticking clock. Eventually we would outgrow our planet. The result would be inevitable: famine, war, and collapse. And by the early 1900s, it looked like Malthus was about to be proven right. The key to all life, the key to all agriculture, is nitrogen. It's a fundamental building block of proteins and DNA. Without it, plants can't grow. For millennia, farmers had replenished nitrogen in their fields through natural means, rotating crops, using manure. But as the global population soared past 1.5 billion, these methods were no longer enough. The world's farms were becoming exhausted, their soil depleted of this vital element. Scientists had found a temporary solution: guano. For decades, ships sailed to remote islands off the coast of South America to mine mountains of bird droppings, rich in nitrogen, and ship it back to fertilize the fields of Europe and North America. But it was a finite resource. The guano mines were running out. Experts predicted that by around 1930, the supply would be exhausted. After that, mass starvation seemed not just possible, but probable. The world was on the brink of a food catastrophe. The clock was ticking. And this is where the great, frustrating irony of the problem lay. Nitrogen wasn't rare. In fact, it's one of the most common elements on Earth. The very air we breathe, the endless ocean of atmosphere above our heads, is nearly 80% nitrogen. There was an almost infinite supply, right there, just out of reach. The problem was, this atmospheric nitrogen exists in an incredibly stable form. Two nitrogen atoms are bound together by one of the strongest triple bonds in chemistry. They are so tightly bonded, so content with each other, that they don't want to react with anything else. For a plant to use it, this bond needed to be broken, and the nitrogen had to be fixed by combining it with hydrogen to form ammonia. Scientists called it the nitrogen problem. For years, the greatest minds in chemistry had tried to solve it. They had tried everything: immense pressures, scorching temperatures, exotic catalysts. But synthesizing ammonia from the air at an industrial scale remained impossible. It was the holy grail of chemistry. Whoever could do it wouldn't just become famous, they would, quite literally, save the world. Enter Fritz Haber. By the early 1900s, Haber was a professor of physical chemistry at the University of Karlsruhe. He was ambitious, driven, and possessed a mind perfectly suited for this kind of monumental challenge. He was a master of thermodynamics, the science of heat and pressure. He saw the nitrogen problem not as a barrier, but as a puzzle of energy and equilibrium. Haber was fueled by a deep, burning desire to prove himself. Born into a prominent Jewish family, in Prussia he felt the sting of being an outsider. He converted to Christianity and embraced German nationalism with the fervor of a convert, desperate to be seen as a true German. He adopted a personal motto that would define his life: in peace for mankind, in war for the fatherland. In this moment, he was focused on the first half of that creed: serving mankind. Solving the nitrogen problem would be his ultimate act of service, his ticket to the inner circle of German greatness. For years, Haber worked relentlessly. He approached the problem with systematic brilliance. He knew that high temperatures were needed to help break the strong nitrogen bond, but he also knew that those same high temperatures pushed the chemical reaction in the wrong direction, causing any ammonia that did form to break back down. It was a frustrating paradox. His genius was in finding the precise, delicate balance. He theorized that if he could use extreme pressure, far higher than anyone had previously attempted, he could force the nitrogen and hydrogen atoms together, even at a more moderate temperature. The pressure would physically squeeze the gas molecules so tightly that they would be more likely to react. He then began a painstaking search for the right catalyst, a substance that could speed up the reaction without being consumed. He tested hundreds of materials. Finally, he found one that worked: osmium, a rare and expensive metal. The conditions required were mind-boggling for the time. Haber designed a tabletop reactor that could withstand pressures of over 200 atmospheres, 200 times the air pressure around us, while simultaneously heating the gases to several hundred degrees Celsius. It was a dangerous high-stakes experiment. A single leak, a single weak point in the metal, and the entire apparatus would explode. Then, on a summer day in July 1909, it happened. Haber and his assistant circulated a mixture of nitrogen and hydrogen gas over the osmium catalyst inside their high-pressure reactor. They watched nervously as the gauges held steady. And then, drop by precious drop, a liquid began to condense in the cooling chamber. It was liquid ammonia. He had done it. Fritz Haber had made bread from the air. He immediately sent a telegram to the industrial giant BASF, the largest chemical company in Germany. The message was simple and confident. He invited their top chemists to a demonstration, promising to show them a process that could produce ammonia at a rate that was commercially viable. The BASF team, including the brilliant industrial chemist Carl Bosch, was skeptical. They had tried and failed themselves. But they came. Haber, with a flair for the dramatic, ran his small machine for them. As the liquid ammonia trickled out, the chemists stood in stunned silence. They knew they were witnessing history. But a tabletop experiment is one thing. Building a factory that could do this on a massive scale was another. This is where Carl Bosch entered the story. Bosch was a metallurgical genius, and he was tasked with turning Haber's miracle into an industrial reality. The challenges were immense. No one had ever built machinery that could handle such pressures and temperatures continuously. Steel pipes became brittle and burst. The rare osmium catalyst was too expensive for mass production. Over the next 4 years, Bosch and his team at BASF achieved engineering feats that were just as impressive as Haber's scientific breakthrough. They designed new types of steel, new multi-layered reactors, and discovered a far cheaper and more effective catalyst based on iron. In 1913, the first industrial Haber-Bosch plant opened in Oppau, Germany. It began churning out tons of ammonia every single day. The impact cannot be overstated. It was the beginning of the end of famine. The Haber-Bosch process unleashed the agricultural revolution of the 20th century. Synthetic fertilizers allowed farmers to produce yields that were previously unimaginable. Crop production exploded. Malthus was wrong. The ticking clock had been silenced. For this monumental achievement, Fritz Haber was awarded the 1918 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The Nobel Committee celebrated him as a benefactor of humanity, a man who had solved a problem that had plagued our species for its entire existence. He had achieved his dream. He was a hero, a savior, a true German patriot who had served mankind in the most profound way possible. He stood at the pinnacle of the scientific world, a man who had, for all intents and purposes, saved billions from starvation. But the year he was awarded that prize, 1918, tells you everything you need to know. Because by then, the world had changed. And Fritz Haber, the savior, had already embraced his other, much darker calling. The same process that created fertilizer to give life was also creating the explosives to take it away. In the summer of 1914, a shot rang out in Sarajevo, and the intricate web of alliances that had held Europe in a fragile peace for decades finally tore apart. The continent plunged into war. But this was not yet the war of mud and death that we remember. In the beginning, it was a glorious adventure. In Germany, a wave of ecstatic nationalism, a phenomenon known as the Spirit of 1914, swept the nation. The people were united in a fervent belief in the righteousness of their cause and the certainty of a swift, decisive victory. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, famously declared, "I know no parties anymore, only Germans." For an outsider like Fritz Haber, who had spent his entire life striving for acceptance, this was an intoxicating moment. This was the ultimate test of his Germanness, the chance to finally and completely belong. Haber didn't just support the war. He embraced it with the full force of his formidable intellect and ambition. He was one of 93 of Germany's most prominent scientists, artists, and writers to sign the infamous Manifesto of the 93. It was a propaganda document that wholeheartedly denied Germany was responsible for the war, denied it had committed any atrocities, and declared that German science and German militarism were one and the same. To the international scientific community, this was a shocking betrayal of intellectual independence. To Haber, it was a declaration of loyalty. He immediately volunteered his services to the German High Command. His first and most critical contribution was a direct extension of his Nobel-winning work. The Haber-Bosch process, which created ammonia for fertilizer, could just as easily create ammonia for munitions. Nitrates derived from ammonia are the key ingredient in manufacturing explosives like TNT. Before the war, Germany had been dependent on nitrate imports from Chile. When the British Royal Navy blockaded German ports at the start of the war, this supply was cut off. Military planners predicted that Germany would run out of gunpowder and shells within 6 months. The war would be lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factory. Fritz Haber's invention changed everything. The same bread from the air process now became the source of explosives from the air. The Haber-Bosch plants went into overdrive, supplying the German army with a virtually limitless supply of munitions. It is no exaggeration to say that Haber's process single-handedly allowed Germany to sustain its war effort for 4 long years. Without him, the war would have been over by 1915. But the swift, glorious victory everyone had predicted never came. By the winter of 1914, the war on the Western Front had bogged down into a brutal, bloody stalemate. Millions of men were entrenched in a vast, continuous line of fortified ditches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The tactics of the day were suicidal. Generals on both sides ordered massive frontal assaults, sending waves of young men over the top into a hail of machine gun fire and artillery shells. The result was a slaughter on an industrial scale. Battles like Verdun and the Somme would see hundreds of thousands of casualties for the gain of only a few hundred yards of mud. The war of movement was dead. It had become a war of attrition. A meat grinder. The German High Command grew desperate. They needed a new weapon, something that could break the deadlock, cross the deadly expanse of no man's land, and force the enemy out of their trenches without the horrific losses of a frontal charge. They needed a scientific solution to a military problem. And Fritz Haber, the patriot, the man who had already saved the war effort once, believed he had the answer. He would now fully dedicate himself to the second half of his motto, "In war for the fatherland." He approached the military leadership with a radical, terrifying proposal. He would not just support the war from his laboratory. He would go to the front lines himself and personally oversee the deployment of a weapon, born directly from his own chemical genius. A weapon that would change the face of warfare forever. Stalemate. By 1915, this was the word that defined the Western Front. The German High Command, led by the pragmatic and ruthless General Erich von Falkenhayn, was desperate for a breakthrough. The war of attrition was bleeding Germany dry, and the British naval blockade was slowly strangling the home front. They needed a game-changer, a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. It was into this atmosphere of desperation that Fritz Haber made his pitch. He argued that the future of warfare was not in bullets and shells, but in chemistry. He proposed using poisonous gas, specifically chlorine, as a tactical weapon. The idea itself wasn't entirely new. Both sides had experimented with primitive tear gas shells with little effect. But what Haber was proposing was on a different scale entirely. He envisioned releasing a massive, rolling cloud of gas that would be heavier than air, sink into the enemy's trenches, and kill them where they stood. The military leadership was divided. Many traditional officers found the idea of poison gas to be repulsive, an unchivalrous and dishonorable way to fight. It violated the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which Germany had signed, explicitly banning the use of poison or poisoned weapons. But desperation was a powerful motivator. Falkenhayn, a pragmatist, was won over by Haber's sheer confidence and scientific certainty. He gave Haber the green light. Haber was granted military rank, eventually rising to captain, and given command of a new pioneering unit, the Special Troop for Gas Warfare. He threw himself into the project with a terrifying zeal, recruiting a team of Germany's brightest young chemists, many of them future Nobel laureates themselves. He saw this not as a moral transgression, but as a patriotic duty and a fascinating scientific problem to be solved. When his colleagues questioned the morality of his work, Haber had a chillingly simple response. In peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world. In wartime, he belongs to his country. To him, death was death, whether it came from a piece of shrapnel or a lungful of poison. His goal was to make death more efficient, to end the war faster and thus, in his twisted logic, save lives in the long run. Chlorine was the perfect candidate for his purpose. It was a common byproduct of the German dye industry, meaning it was available in huge quantities. It was 2.5 times denser than air, ensuring it would hug the ground and sink deep into enemy fortifications. And its effects on the human body were devastating. When inhaled, chlorine gas reacts with the water in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. It creates a chemical burn that strips the lining of the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid. The victims would experience excruciating pain, a feeling of burning and suffocation, as they slowly and agonizingly drowned from the inside out. It was a gruesome, terrifying way to die. Haber's plan was audacious. Instead of firing the gas in shells, which would disperse it too quickly, he decided to use a method of brute force. Under the cover of darkness, his special troops hauled nearly 6,000 heavy steel cylinders, containing over 160 tons of liquid chlorine, to the front lines near the Belgian town of Ypres. They dug them into the forward edge of the German trenches, facing a section of the line held by French territorial and Algerian troops. The success of the entire operation depended on one factor Haber could not control: the wind. He needed a steady, gentle breeze blowing from the east towards the Allied lines. For weeks, Haber waited at his command post, a man of science now at the mercy of the weather. He paced nervously, studying weather charts, his entire project hanging in the balance. The soldiers in the trenches grew wary of the strange cylinders buried in their parapets, and the Allied High Command received intelligence from captured German soldiers about a secret weapon, but dismissed the warnings as absurd. Then, in the late afternoon of April 22, 1915, the wind turned. A steady northeasterly breeze began to blow. The moment had come. At 5:30 p.m., on Haber's command, the German soldiers opened the valves on the cylinders. At first, the French and Algerian soldiers stared in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. They described it as a strange green cloud that crept along the ground. They thought it might be a smokescreen for an infantry attack. They were curious, not afraid. Then the cloud reached them. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A wave of suffocating terror swept through the trenches. The air filled with the smell of pineapple and pepper, as the soldiers described it. Then came the burning. A searing pain in the eyes, the throat, the lungs. Men began coughing uncontrollably, their faces turning blue as they asphyxiated. They clawed at their own necks, desperate for a breath that wouldn't burn. Panic shattered the line. Those who could still move fled in sheer terror, their lungs on fire. They ran, but they couldn't outrun the cloud. Many fell, writhing in agony on the ground. The gas, being heavier than air, pursued them, sinking into shell holes and dugouts where men had tried to take cover, offering no escape. Within minutes, a 4-mile-wide gap had been torn in the Allied front line. The path to Ypres, and potentially a decisive victory, was wide open. An English officer who witnessed the scene described it. A panic-stricken rabble of soldiers, blinded, coughing, chests heaving, faces a dreadful mahogany color, gasping for breath and dying as they run. Another wrote of the dead, "Their faces, arms, hands were a shiny grey-black color, their mouths open, their eyes staring glassily." Fritz Haber had delivered on his promise. His weapon was a horrifying success. But the German infantry, who had been ordered to advance behind the cloud, were just as terrified of the gas as the Allies. They were ill-equipped with only primitive protection and hesitant to advance into the poisoned landscape. The breakthrough was not exploited. The strategic opportunity was lost. But tactically the point had been proven. A new and terrible chapter in the history of warfare had been opened. Fritz Haber, standing at his observation post watching the chaos unfold, saw only the success of his experiment. He had broken the stalemate. That night, he and his officers held a dinner to celebrate their victory. But the cost of that victory, both on the battlefield and in his own home, was about to become devastatingly clear. While Fritz Haber celebrated his ghastly success at Ypres, a storm was gathering in his own home in the affluent Berlin suburb of Dahlem. This storm had a name: Clara Haber, born Clara Immerwahr. And she was not just the wife of a famous scientist, she was a formidable scientist in her own right, and she was watching her husband's work with a growing sense of dread and horror. Clara was a pioneer. In a time when women were actively discouraged from higher education, she had fought tooth and nail for her place in the academic world. She was brilliant, determined, and passionate about science. In 1900, she became the first woman to be awarded a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Breslau, and she did so with the highest distinction, magna cum laude. Her doctoral thesis was a significant piece of research, and she had a promising career ahead of her. She had met Fritz Haber years earlier, another bright young chemist from her hometown. They fell in love, and in 1901 they married. But the realities of marriage in the early 20th century quickly suffocated Clara's ambitions. Fritz's career was all-consuming, his ambition boundless. Clara was expected to be the supportive wife, the hostess, the mother to their son, Hermann. Her own scientific work was relegated to the background, reduced to occasionally helping Fritz translate his papers or offering uncredited contributions to his research. She once wrote to a friend, lamenting that "the life Fritz has offered me is very short. What remains is a deep dissatisfaction with myself." Despite her frustrations, she held a profound belief in the ideals of science. She, like many, saw it as a force for enlightenment and progress, a tool to illuminate the world and improve the human condition. This was the core of her identity, and it was this core belief that put her on a collision course with the man she loved. When the war began, and Fritz dedicated his laboratory to the German war machine, Clara was deeply troubled. But when he began the development of poison gas, she was utterly horrified. She saw it as a fundamental betrayal of everything science was supposed to stand for. To her, this wasn't just a new weapon. It was a perversion of science, a monstrous twisting of their shared passion into a tool for industrialized slaughter. Their home became a battlefield of ideologies. Clara openly condemned her husband's work, pleading with him to stop. She called it a sign of barbarity, corrupting the very discipline which ought to bring new insights into life. Their arguments were fierce and frequent. Haber, blinded by patriotic fervor and convinced of the righteousness of his cause, dismissed her concerns as naive and hysterical. He accused her of treason, of failing to support the fatherland in its hour of need. To him, her pacifism was a personal betrayal. To her, his work was a betrayal of all humanity. In late April 1915, Haber returned home from the front lines in Belgium. He was not returning in shame, but in triumph. He had just personally overseen the first successful gas attack at Ypres and was in Berlin to attend a celebratory dinner held in his honor. He was the man of the hour, a hero of the fatherland. For Clara, this was the final, unbearable straw. The abstract horror she had been fighting against was now a reality. Thousands of men were dead, their lives extinguished by the direct application of her husband's genius. And he was being celebrated for it. According to friends, she confronted him one last time, begging him to abandon the gas program. He refused and was reportedly preparing to leave the very next day to oversee a gas attack on the Eastern Front. The man she had married, the brilliant scientist, was now, in her eyes, a mass murderer. On the night of May the 1st, following the party, the story takes its final tragic turn. What happened next is pieced together from the accounts of those who knew them. After the guests had left, Clara and Fritz had one last terrible argument. In the early hours of May 2nd, 1915, while Fritz Haber slept, Clara Immerwahr walked out into the garden of their villa. She took her husband's army-issued revolver, pointed it at her own chest, and pulled the trigger. She did not die instantly. She was found by their 12-year-old son, Hermann, who had been woken by the shot. She died in his arms. Clara Imovar's suicide was a deliberate act of protest. It was the final, desperate statement of a brilliant mind pushed to the edge, a protest against the perversion of science and the horrors of war, made in the most personal and devastating way imaginable. It was a cry of despair from a house divided against itself. Fritz Haber's reaction was shockingly cold. The very next morning, leaving his dead wife and traumatized son behind, he boarded a train for the Eastern Front to supervise the next poison gas attack against Russian troops. The war effort could not wait. The fatherland demanded his service. The personal cost, it seemed, was a price he was willing to pay. But the ghost of his wife and the consequences of his choices would follow him for the rest of his life. In November 1918, the guns of the Great War finally fell silent. Germany was defeated, the Kaiser had abdicated, and the nation was left to grapple with the immense human and economic cost of the conflict. For most of the world, Fritz Haber was not a hero. He was the father of chemical warfare, a man who had unleashed a new and uniquely cruel method of killing. The victorious Allies named him an international war criminal. They sought his extradition to stand trial for violating the Hague Conventions. The man who had dreamed of being celebrated as Germany's greatest patriot was now a fugitive. To avoid capture, Haber shaved his signature mustache, obtained a false passport, and fled to the neutral haven of Switzerland. He hid there for several months, waiting for the political climate to cool, a wanted man in the new world order he had helped to create. And then came the first great irony. In a decision that sparked outrage across the Allied world, the Nobel Committee in Sweden announced its choice for the 1918 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, which had been deferred due to the war. The prize was awarded to Fritz Haber for his synthesis of ammonia from its elements. The world was stunned. How could the man branded a war criminal be given the world's most prestigious scientific award? French, British, and American scientists boycotted the award ceremony in protest. The committee's justification was cold and clinical. They were honoring the Haber of 1909, the man who made bread from the air, not the Haber of 1915, the man who made poison gas. They attempted to cleave his legacy in two, to separate the savior from the monster. But Haber himself never made such a distinction. When he finally emerged from hiding to accept his prize in 1919, his speech was defiant. He defended his wartime service as the act of a patriot. He argued that poison gas was no more or less cruel than high-explosive shells, and that its development was a necessary act to try and bring the war to a swift conclusion. He showed no remorse. He accepted the gold medal not as a man with a divided soul, but as one who believed to his core that both of his great works, the fertilizer and the gas, were righteous acts of service to Germany. Returning to Germany, Haber was not a pariah, but a pillar of the establishment. He was the powerful and respected director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin, a hub of international science that attracted the world's greatest minds, including a young Albert Einstein. He was a scientific titan, a man of immense influence and prestige within the fragile Weimar Republic. But his patriotism still burned. He was obsessed with paying off the crushing war reparations that the Treaty of Versailles had imposed on Germany. And once again, he turned to science for a solution. He became fixated on a fantastically improbable idea: extracting gold from seawater. For years, he and his institute spent a fortune meticulously analyzing ocean water samples from around the globe, convinced that he could find a chemical process to restore Germany's wealth. The project was a colossal failure. After years of painstaking work, Haber discovered that the concentration of gold in seawater was thousands of times lower than previous estimates. The process would cost far more than the value of any gold it could ever extract. It was a public and expensive humiliation. At the same time, his institute continued its work on gases, ostensibly for peaceful purposes. Under his directorship, a team was tasked with developing powerful new insecticides to help fumigate grain silos and delouse buildings, a major public health concern. They focused on hydrogen cyanide-based pesticides. Cyanide is a brutally efficient poison, but it is also highly volatile and dangerous to handle. To make it safer, Huber's chemists developed a method of infusing the liquid hydrogen cyanide into a porous solid carrier like diatomaceous earth. The resulting product was a solid substance that, when exposed to air, would slowly release the deadly cyanide gas. To ensure people were not accidentally exposed, they added a pungent warning odorant. They gave their invention a trade name, Zyklon-B. The year is 1933. The fragile Weimar Republic collapses. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rise to power. Their ideology of racial purity and virulent anti-Semitism becomes the law of the land. And here, the final, most horrific irony of Fritz Haber's life crashes down upon him. Haber, the man who had converted to Christianity, who had signed the Manifesto of the 93, who had personally weaponized chlorine for the fatherland, who had defined his entire identity through his service to Germany, was now officially classified by the state as a non-Aryan. He was classified as a Jew. His life's work, his patriotism, his Nobel Prize, it all meant nothing. The new regime demanded that he dismiss all the Jewish scientists working at his institute. Haber, to his credit, refused. Having spent a lifetime trying to assimilate, he was now faced with a demand that crossed his final moral line. He could not betray his colleagues. Instead of complying, he resigned his directorship, writing to a friend, "For more than 40 years I have selected my collaborators on the basis of their intelligence and their character, and not on the basis of their grandmothers. I cannot, for the rest of my few years, change this method which I have found so good." At the age of 64, Fritz Haber became a man without a country. The nation he had fed, the army he had armed, the government he had served, had cast him out. He was forced into exile, wandering through Europe, a ghost of his former self. Albert Einstein, who had once been his colleague and friend but had become a staunch pacifist who condemned Haber's war work, now took pity on him, trying to find him a position abroad. Haber's health failed. He died of a heart attack in a hotel in Basel, Switzerland, in January 1934, a broken and disillusioned man. He died stateless, having been rejected by the very country for which he had sacrificed his wife, his reputation, and his soul. But the story doesn't end there, because the Nazis who had driven him out were great admirers of his work. They saw the efficiency of his methods, and they took his institute's invention, Zyklon-B, and they made one small cost-saving modification. They removed the warning odorant. In the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other extermination camps, the Nazi regime would use this odorless version of Zyklon-B to perpetrate the Holocaust. The chemical process developed under the directorship of Fritz Haber was used to murder millions, including, it is believed, members of his own extended family. The ultimate perversion of his science was complete. The patriot who created poison gas for German soldiers had inadvertently helped create the tool that would be used to murder his own people. In the end, Fritz Haber died as he had lived, a man of devastating contradictions. He died in a hotel in Basel, Switzerland, a country that was not his own, his heart physically giving out, perhaps from the strain of being so thoroughly broken. He was a man who had everything, a Nobel Prize, immense wealth, international fame, the ear of generals and statesmen, and in the end, he had nothing. No home, no country, no family to speak of. The fatherland he had worshipped had disowned him, and the scientific community he had once led looked upon him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. His final wishes were a testament to his fractured life. He asked to be buried in Basel, alongside his first wife, Clara Immerwahr. the wife whose scientific career he had stifled, whose moral objections he had scorned, and whose suicide he had callously ignored. It was a final, belated admission of a debt that could never be repaid, a quiet acknowledgement of the ghost that had haunted him for 2 decades. It was as if, at the very end, the man who never showed remorse was seeking a final, silent reconciliation. So what is the legacy of Fritz Haber? It is, like the man himself, irrevocably split in 2. You cannot separate the hero from the monster because they were one and the same. The same mind, the same ambition, the same relentless drive to solve a problem, whether that problem was feeding the world or killing on an industrial scale. Today, it is estimated that the Haber-Bosch process for creating fertilizer is responsible for sustaining roughly half of the world's population. Billions of people are alive today because Fritz Haber figured out how to make bread from the air. Look at the world around you. The sheer scale of our civilization, our ability to feed 8 billion people, is in large part his legacy. He is, without question, one of the most influential and important scientists who has ever lived. And yet, he is also the man who opened Pandora's box. He personally oversaw the first large-scale chemical weapons attack in modern history, unleashing a form of warfare so horrific that its shadow still hangs over us today. His work laid the foundation for a new kind of terror, one that would be refined and perfected by regimes far more evil than his own. His fervent patriotism, his belief that science must serve the state without question, led him down a path of moral nihilism from which he could never truly return. And in the most bitter twist of fate, his own institute's research was twisted into the tool of his own people's destruction. Haber believed he could divide his life, his morality, into 2 neat halves: service to humanity in times of peace and absolute service to his country in times of war. But his story is the ultimate proof that such a division is impossible. Science is not a tool that can be picked up and put down, used for good one day and evil the next, without consequence. The knowledge, once unleashed, cannot be put back in the box. The scientist cannot be separated from the moral implications of their creation. Fritz Haber's life is not a simple story with a clear lesson. It is a dark mirror held up to the 20th century and to ourselves. It asks us a deeply uncomfortable question. What is the purpose of science? Is it to serve humanity or to serve power? What happens when patriotism demands that we abandon our morality? And how thin is the line between a genius who saves the world and one who helps destroy it?